Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries. It is a real privilege to have Paul Warren with us via phone today from Boston to discuss his July Last Days Beacon article entitled The Resurrection of Tyranny on the 240th Anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. As we know, this is the month of July. We're airing this on July 31st. And this is the 240th anniversary month of the Declaration of Independence, which, as we all know, was signed on July 4th, 1776. Now, I have been privileged to get to know Paul at a previous ministry where I served, where he did some writing for us. And in the providence of God, we've recently reconnected in this new ministry at Southwest Prophecy Ministry. And I asked Paul to write our July Last Days Beacon article, which is entitled The Resurrection of Tyranny on the 240th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, at the end of today's broadcast, my friends, I will give information as to how you can obtain a copy or multiple copies of this article. Well, Paul is a real expert on American history. I am sure you will be fascinated by what he has to share today. Paul Warren is a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier. He and his wife live in Boston. He founded a Boston magazine many years ago and has been a Boston journalist for many years. And of course, Boston is the greatest place to live in terms of American revolutionary history. So, Paul, thank you for being with us on the broadcast today.
Thank you, David. It's nice to be here.
Well, tell us something about your background and how you became interested in the history behind the Declaration of Independence.
Well, my family on both sides were colonists in the Philadelphia area, and at least one of my great-great-great-grandfathers was a soldier in the American Revolution, and my family heard one of the readings of the Declaration of Independence. They had different readings in different cities and towns, so I grew up saturated in American history in Philadelphia, and then when I moved to Boston, in fact, I can look out my dining room window and see the road where George Washington came to Boston to take over the Continental Army.
Wow. Well, as I say, Boston is really the epicenter of Revolutionary War history. So many amazing things happened. We could, I'm sure, talk for hours just about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the events that took place in the Boston area, and of course, some of the great Boston patriots. But we'll try to focus on the Declaration of Independence itself as a document. Now, as I've read your article, and we've talked prior to the broadcast, you have maintained that the Declaration of Independence is a fundamentalist document. And we hear the word fundamentalist used in a very negative way today, in reference to other religions. But you believe and articulate in your article that there are some fundamentalists, that is, Christian fundamentals, that are implicit in the Declaration. Let's talk about what those fundamentalist beliefs are.
Well, let's set the whole phenomenon of American fundamentalism in its historic context. American fundamentalism is actually an import from England. English intellectuals at Oxford and Cambridge did the most refined analysis of the Bible, the original languages, and very, very scientifically. And that was exported along with the colonists that came over in Virginia, and the Puritans in Boston, and the Quakers in Philadelphia. And the Declaration is really a summary of the beliefs of the American people. These are not just the private beliefs of the 50-some founding fathers. And so what you have is, as you know, every writer knows, the most important places in an article at the beginning and at the end. So at the beginning we have two descriptions of God. He's the creator, and he's nature's God, which means that he rules the universe with laws. So right off the bat, they're saying that God is at the center of this revolution. And then at the end, there's two terms, the supreme judge of the world and divine providence. And by supreme judge of the world, if you read the sentence that's in there, they're asking God to judge their intentions. Is this just a colonial revolt, or is this something that God will judge? And really, the Declaration of Independence is the most theological political document in the modern age.
Yeah, it really is. And it's so foundational to the Constitution that followed many years later. And of course, we all know that there were 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the largest signature was given by John Hancock, who I believe was a citizen of Boston and governor of Massachusetts at one point in time. So you contend then that the Declaration of Independence is really a fundamentalist document as it relates to the person of God. Now there is, of course, we know that in the heart of the Declaration is really an apologetic for the American Revolution, where the long train of offenses committed by King George III was chronicled. And there seems to be within that a document which is very fundamentalist, a desire, obviously a stated desire for freedom, but really kind of in the biblical motif of freedom. Share with us, Paul, what from your study of the founders, what was the biblical motif that the founders believed in reference to their desire for freedom?
Well, the American colonists, and even many great thinkers in Europe, in particular England, from the time of the colonizing, they believed that America would become a nation and become, according to George Berkeley, who was an Anglican clergyman and one of the brightest lights of the Enlightenment philosophers, he said that in 1726, in other words, about a half century before the Declaration was written, Berkeley wrote a poem called Verses on America, in which he prophesied that America would become a nation, and at that stage of the game, it was very questionable whether the colonies would separate from Great Britain, but that it would become the greatest nation in history. And so the Founding Fathers were very influenced by that. And really, the revolution could not have happened without the understanding by the colonists, in particular by the founders, that America was prophesied in the Bible, and that the American Revolution was God's idea. The Declaration of Independence is the warrant for revolution. In other words, the founding, America was a highly biblical culture. How do you revolt against the king or the empire when Paul and even Jesus says you shouldn't revolt? The warrant is that King George III had violated his commission, according to the English church and the English state, that he was to be a vicar of Christ. In other words, he was to be Christ's agent in England. But he was acting like the devil. He was acting like a tyrant. And that was the warrant for them to revolt, because if they're Christians and their king is Jesus Christ, then they have the right to revolt against a diabolical tyrant. But I think you were getting at the motif that they
yes.
had in their minds.
Yes.
Well, Declaration of Independence was read in the morning in Philadelphia that afternoon, a three-man committee, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson met to design the national insignia. So at this stage of the game, they believe they're going to win the war, but that God's going to win it for them. So Jefferson and Franklin, independent of each other, designed a proposal. They're very similar pictures drawn from the second book of the Bible, Exodus, of God freeing the Hebrews and defeating Pharaoh. And that was not so much a picture of the mind of Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, but of the majority opinion of the colonists. They believed that this was going to be a deja vu, history repeating itself, that God was going to free Christ's people in the colonies and bring them into the promised land.
So King George III was the colonial equivalent to the Pharaoh.
Yes, they actually called him that.
Isn't that interesting? Well, that leads me to my next question. How then did the founders think of the role that George Washington played? Subsequent, of course, to the signing of the Declaration, what role did the founders think that Washington played in gaining America's freedom?
Well, Washington was called America's Moses from the end of the American Revolution, 1783, I think it was, up to and even past his death a few decades later. Eulogies typically refer to him as America's Moses, and this idea is preserved for us today in the Capitol building in Washington. There's a painting on the ceiling of Washington like Moses being escorted to heaven by angels after completing his assignment.
That's amazing. And I remember seeing a statue in the Smithsonian Museum of American History where Washington is seated on a kind of a throne-looking thing, and he certainly reminds you of Moses. He has a certain dignity to him. So, and this was an early depiction of Washington in the early 1800s. So he was certainly revered as America's deliverer, much as Moses was God's instrument for deliverance unto the Pharaohs. Well, yes, go ahead.
Excuse me, David. His reputation. There was no one in the 18th century, the end of the 18th century, who was more respected in the world, not just in America, but in the world, than Moses. I mean, he was surely a divinely appointed agent.
Absolutely. For those who've just joined us, we are speaking today with Paul Warren about his brand new Last Days Beacon article entitled The Resurrection of Tyranny on the 240th Anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, it's interesting, Paul, that in reading your article, you fast forward from the Revolutionary War period and the Declaration of Independence with its fundamentalist beliefs, foundational beliefs as it relates to God himself. You fast forward to the Scopes trial of 1925 as affecting the fundamentalism upon which the Declaration was built. Could you expand on that?
Well, there was, from the time that the Puritans landed up to into the 1920s, particularly after the Civil War, the United States victory of the Civil War, a standard belief in the bottom line of the Bible, the things that God was actually saying in the Bible, which became known as fundamentalism. And there was this conspiracy of humanists, religious humanists. They were eugenicists and believed in abortion, and they began plotting after World War I to destroy this basic American belief in the Bible and its relationship to America. And the Scopes trial was held in the very middle of the July 1925, of the Roaring Twenties. Up to the spring of 1925, the typical American was completely on the same page with the five fundamentals of the Bible. The Scopes trial happened, and when you strip away everything, the intent of the Scopes trial, and it was a conspiracy and it was a mind control trick, the goal was to demote the standard understanding of America and its relationship to the Bible, and elevate evolution to the status of proven science. Well, there was, in a scientific experiment, before you do the experiment, you take notes on the subject, you measure the subject. And then after the experiment, you take notes on the subject to see what's changed. Well, there was a study done, a very famous study, called Middletown. And this husband and wife surveyed a middle-class American town to see what its beliefs were. And what they found were that Americans were largely on the same page with the fundamentalists. In the early 30s, after the Scopes trial, they did another study in the same town, and they found that things had changed dramatically. Now people did not believe in the literal meaning and understanding of the Bible. And so what we see, and the Scopes trial was called the trial of the century by the people who put it on, is that it was the beginning of the culture war. So the mass media is in its cradle in the 1920s. I mean, it's just sort of developing. You had movies and newsreels and radio and magazines. And the culture war began that. And if you take a good look at the culture war, what you see is that it's not a culture war, it's a spiritual war. It was humanists going to war against the American understanding of the Bible.
Yes, and I remember studying the trial of the century when I was in public schools many years ago. And they did depict the Scopes trial as basically the failure or death of fundamentalism in America as the prevailing view. Now, what were some of the negative impacts subsequently that occurred after the Scopes trial in 1925?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean, David.
Well, governmentally, we have in the 1930s a new direction by an American president. Right.
The guy who was advising Clarence Darrow in the Scopes trial, giving him all the Bible questions to ask William Jennings Bryan, was a Unitarian minister by the name of Charles Potter. And Potter began writing this book, Humanism, A New Religion. It was published in 1930, and in the book he advocated teaching the religion of humanism in public schools. And he actually said, and this is very close to an exact quote, what chance do Christians have with 1 hour on a Sunday when we can be teaching our religion 5 days a week in public schools? The New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, was the basis of it, theological basis of it, was the religion of humanism. And FDR changed American belief from a belief in the salvation of Christ to a belief in the salvation of New Deal socialist government.
So in other words, the state becomes God.
Exactly.
Well, of course, we know the founder, who's the gentleman who's considered the father of modern education, John Dewey, was a principal author of the Humanist Manifesto of 1932. So humanism rapidly came to replace the fundamentalism that was the dominant worldview of Americans prior to the Scopes trial. Is that a fair representation?
Absolutely, David. Potter and Dewey were co-religionists, and they were close friends. Dewey became the father of progressive education. And so Dewey implemented Potter's suggestion that this new religion of humanism would be evangelized secretly in public schools. And so when you look at public education today, it's at war with the Bible and Christianity, and has sowed all these beliefs that at their core paint man as God. And we can't forget that the thing that made Eve in the Garden of Eden take a bite out of the forbidden fruit was when Satan said, and it will make you like God. So there's huge ramifications here.
Well, let's fast forward 91 years from the Scopes trial of 1925 to our present day. And one of the themes that I see in your article is the idea of a deja vu, that history tends to repeat itself.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as America's historical deja vu in terms of America's modern Pharaoh?
Well, it's almost too perfect symbolism. King George was viewed as Pharaoh. Well, President Obama is an African American president who rules like an imperious African pharaoh, walking all over the Declaration's younger brother, the Constitution. And really, I think Christians have to take a serious look on how this happened, because God has promised in the Bible, and Americans always knew this, that as you honor Him, He will protect you. But when Americans turn against God, when Americans begin denying certain things that He has said in His Word, God will abandon Americans. And so it's sort of ask, well, how did Barack Obama happen? How did the election of him happen? And it's, I believe, a judgment of God on lukewarm American Christianity.
Well, it does seem that as you look back over the sweep of history, that humanity is really faced with two basic choices. Will you worship the one or true God, or will you allow some human substitute, i.e. human government, usually is how it devolves? Will the state become your God? And so there's really no intermediate ground on that.
Right.
And so in the 90 years since the, quote, destruction of fundamentalism is America's prevailing worldview, now we find ourselves faced with another Pharaoh that is perhaps as, how should we say, tyrannical as King George or the Pharaoh over the Hebrews.
Well, he's much more like the Pharaoh over the Hebrews. King George, if you look at the situation the American colonists rebelled against, King George looks pretty reasonable compared to President Obama.
Plus, he resided on the other side of the pond, so there was some protection just in terms of distance, whereas, of course, America's current Pharaoh resides in Washington, D.C. No real safe havens there. Well, another deja vu issue that we've talked about offline has to do with the resurgence of Islamic terrorism. Do you see that as in some way a deja vu event to early American history?
Well, Thomas Jefferson became president in 1800. In 1801, the very edge of the Ottoman Empire, which was on the Barbary coast of Africa, was capturing American ships and putting American sailors into Muslim slavery, which is worse than American slavery. And it finally, the barbarian jihadists in Tripoli called war, jihad, on America in 1801. They took down the flag at the embassy, American flag, and they burned it. And that began something that's popularly called the Barbary War. So they called war on 1801. 2001 is the 200th anniversary of that war. And Muslims are very big into symbolism. And so the question becomes, was that just a coincidence, or are they saying in symbol, we're reviving the war that we began in 1801, and this time we're going to win it? Now, what makes the date that they started the war even more significant, on September 11th.
Yes.
September 11th was the day that the first Islamic jihad against Christendom, which began in 1009, ended. It ended on September 11th, 1683, at the gates of Vienna. And ironically, or providentially, 1683 is when William Penn was establishing Philadelphia, where the Declaration was written.
Wow, so many deja vu events. I think it was Santayana, the philosopher, who said those who do not learn from history's lessons are doomed to repeat them. And it looks like we're repeating them in spades today.
And we're doing it, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like time has gotten away from us, Paul. I do want to thank you for being with us today and sharing this very interesting information with our listeners.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, David.
And dear listener, I'm sure that you will want to obtain several copies of the article that we discussed today. And we just scratched the surface in terms of the content. You may obtain 5 copies of The Resurrection of Tyranny for a gift offering of $5, 25 copies for $15, 50 copies for $30, 100 copies for $60. Now, you may obtain copies 3 different ways. You can call us at 1-405-604-5975. That's 1-405-604-5975. Or you may order by going to our website. Our web address is swpm.us. Once you are on the website, click on the bookstore. The Resurrection of Tyranny is found in the literature section of our bookstore. Or you may order copies through the mail. Write to SWPM, P.O. Box 58043, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma 73157. That is Post Office Box 58043, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma 73157. Thank you for joining us today. Please tune in again at the same time next week for our next Last Days Beacon program. Until then, keep occupying until he comes.